Here's Ben Shapiro and Ed Fazer to try to explain why atheism is becoming so much more common.
With all of this said, if these arguments are plausible, why do you think it is that they're increasingly unpopular? Levels of religious activity are going down in the West. Levels of religious belief are going down in the West. Is it just that people have never dealt with these arguments, or they decide that they're not interested in hearing the arguments because it's more fun to be atheist than not to be atheist?
It's not just more fun to be atheist than not to be atheist. For many people, obeying the rules that religious folks insist we obey is altogether intolerable. I don't believe in God because I don't understand what it even means to say that a God exists. But even if I did believe in God, I don't think I'd be capable of abiding by all of the rules.
Why is atheism gaining, does it feel?
It's a little bit of both. I would say, speaking from the perspective of an academic philosopher,
which is not a particularly helpful perspective when the issue is sociological and psychological.
A major part of the problem is the hyper-specialization of modern academic life. We just know so much about so many different things that you could spend your whole life, for example, just doing molecular biology and never read anything in any other discipline, and you still will not have plumbed the depths of that one field. It's not a little field, but that one field, molecular biology, right? That's true even in philosophy itself and in different academic disciplines. They've all got their sub-disciplines, and you could spend your whole life just studying the sub-disciplines. Now, what follows from that is that you have fewer and fewer generalists in modern academic life. In other words, people who try to look at the big picture. If you're talking about an Aristotle, or to go back, far fewer centuries, a Descartes, or even to go back 100 years, 150 years, the average philosopher or scientist in those days, for most of the history of Western thought up until about a century or so ago, could literally be a know-it-all.
Even among philosophers who specialize in philosophy of religion, there are plenty of atheists. The problem is not a matter of people not hearing the arguments or not understanding them. I hear the arguments and understand them, and I still find them unconvincing. However, I don't think this accounts for the prevalence of atheism in the general population, because even when there still could be a lot of philosophical generalists, the reason people are or are not religious doesn't seem to me to be a matter of having heard or not heard arguments for God's existence. How many conversion stories have you heard that involved a person being convinced by an argument? Most of the conversion stories I hear have to do with some variety of experience. Someone witnessed something they perceived as miraculous, or they saw a vision or heard a voice. Cases of people becoming religious because they heard an argument are so rare that I don't think I've ever even heard one. People not hearing arguments is not the explanation for the popularity of atheism.
You could still master all the different bodies of knowledge, and you can know a lot about philosophy and a lot about physics and a lot about biology and all the rest. Much harder to do that now. So part of the problem is that you get people outside of philosophy, but also even people within philosophy who simply don't know a whole lot about the kind of arguments that I talk about in the book. They may know nothing more than whatever cliches were trotted out in their introduction to philosophy class when they were a freshman or a sophomore, and they heard some of the canned objections that were aimed at caricatures of Aquinas or Aristotle and Leibniz, and then they never look back.
But even among the folks within philosophy who do know a whole lot about these arguments, there is no shortage of atheists.
And then they repeat it to their own students when they teach an introduction to philosophy class, say. So part of the problem is just that. It's lack of knowledge on the part of your average intellectual or your average academic, because modern intellectual life has become so specialized and fragmented.
Again, how big a part of the problem of atheism in the general population could this account for? As I said, it seems rare that people become religious because of an argument. Most religious folks don't seem to spend a lot of time mulling over apologists' arguments, nor do they become religious by doing so.
It's hard to know enough about the issue. Unfortunately, ego prevents people from refraining from talking about things they don't know about. So you'll have someone like a Richard Dawkins, for example, who's undeniably a brilliant man, a very good writer and so forth. He knows a lot about biology. Unfortunately, he knows very little about philosophy and even less about theology.
Yes, I would argue that if you want to engage with apologetic arguments, I would not recommend looking to Dawkins. With respect to philosophy, he is a layman. However, Daniel Dennett is not. Graham Oppy is not. Bertrand Russell is not.
But for some reason, that doesn't keep him from pontificating on those subjects, right? So he trots out the stock objections that he might have heard when he was an undergraduate, and he doesn't bother to sort of do the research and so forth.
If you read the philosophical arguments in Dawkins's book The God Delusion, they are very shallow. He gives facile summaries of some common apologist arguments and facile rebuttals to them. I noticed this when I read it, and when I was in college, I had philosophy professors who were atheists who also found this to be very disappointing. But it is for this reason that Dawkins doesn't have much, if any, influence on professional philosophers who are atheists. With respect to philosophy, Dawkins has never been influential, and I would propose that he's not very influential among atheists generally nowadays. Atheists haven't much cared what Dawkins has had to say for about the last 10 years. In retrospect, I think the Four Horsemen were largely riding Hitchens's coattails, and when he died, the popularity of the rest of them stagnated at best from then on.
And so what happens is when someone with that degree of prominence repeats these same tiresome and tired objections, then that gives them new life, because people think, well, Richard Dawkins, he's a smart guy, he's an Oxford professor, he must know what he's talking about. Well, not necessarily.
Again, I think Ed's overestimating the influence of Dawkins. Apologists these days seem to talk about Dawkins a lot more than atheists do.
But that gives a whole other generation of young people, students and so forth, the same erroneous ideas about the arguments, and so they get perpetuated that way. That's another part of the reason.
Again, when I was a philosophy student, I was able to notice how poor Dawkins's philosophical arguments were. And even if I couldn't, my professors could and said so. I can't stress enough how little influence Dawkins has on philosophy students, much less professional philosophers. Now here's Ben to give a very unconvincing argument for God's existence.
What is your favorite argument for God's existence and why?
So my favorite argument for God's existence is that I believe in free will. Okay, the reason that I think this is an argument for God's existence is because if you believe that human beings are essentially just balls of meat wandering around aimlessly in the universe, the kind of Spinoza's stone that thinks that it was moving of its own accord but actually was thrown, if you believe that and you don't believe in free will, then there's an internal coherence and logic to it. If you believe that you have the ability to make independent choices, that you can actually supersede your own biological drives and the environment around you to any extent, even to the smallest extent, this means that you believe in something that can't actually be proved by science, but that you are living every single day.
I don't know for sure whether the choices I make are entirely determined, or whether there is some element of chance involved. But regardless of which is the case, both are compatible with the idea that there is no such thing as the supernatural. In quantum mechanics and in thermodynamics, there are events which cannot be explained by completely deterministic causes. Science cannot trace their occurrence to a completely deterministic cause. However, scientists don't infer from this that the supernatural exists. They make the much simpler inference that chance occurrences are part of material reality. If this is what is meant by free will, then free will need not have anything to do with God.
And the notion that you have that will, and not only that you have that will, but that will is capable of comprehending the universe around you, that your will is your ideas, your ability to comprehend the universe is a reflection of a reality, of an objective truth that is out there, that says to me that there is a God, there's a common source that stands behind that objective truth and stands behind the mind that can comprehend that truth.
How does that even follow logically? This seems like a non sequitur to me. Why would a conscious mind need to stand behind objective truth? Why can't our minds give a description of reality that accurately depicts it without that reality needing to be backed by some other mind? I think this is yet another example of theists making the baseless assumption that the default state of reality must be chaos, and that the only way order and intelligibility can exist is if a conscious mind deliberately imposes it. Now here's Ben to give some strawman arguments about the relationship between science and the idea of God.
When you talk about confirmation bias, I wonder your opinion on sort of the confirmation bias that surrounds the question of science and God. So on the one side, you have folks like Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins who suggest that science has conclusively disproved the existence of God.
Have they, though? I'd like to see some exact quotes on that, because I don't recall Dawkins or Harris saying that science has conclusively disproved the existence of God. But if they did, I disagree on the very simple grounds that the idea of God is not falsifiable, and therefore cannot be disproven by science, and is instead completely epistemically useless even if a God does exist.
That science absolutely cuts against the existence of a greater being with a plan for the universe.
I can't see anyone who understands how falsifiability works having that opinion.
And then on the other side, you have folks like Stephen Meyer who say, no. When you look at the science, what you see is God's signature in the cell and DNA. You see sort of clues that God has left behind as to the organization of nature in a particular way that bespeaks of an intelligence beyond mere evolution, for example.
How could there possibly be scientific evidence of a timeless, spaceless, disembodied mind? Stephen Meyer, by the way, is the guy who created the teach the controversy strategy to try to get creationism taught in public schools in a way that circumvents the First Amendment. More importantly, he's not a scientist.
Do you think that science cuts in favor or against God, or do you think that science really doesn't have much to say on the issue?
It's been generally accepted since Popper that science simply cannot usefully digest ideas that are not falsifiable through experimentation. I think the idea of a timeless, spaceless, disembodied mind would be pretty hard to falsify. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.